Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
We will have to go much further and make cuts far greater than I asked for at the beginning of the year.
After the deficit soars to $16 billion, there's plenty of pain in Governor Brown's May budget revision, with more cuts to health service and welfare programs and reduced pay for state workers. Term limits are back on the ballot. Proposition 28 would change California's strict limits by reducing time in the state legislature from 14 years to 12, but allow all of that time to be served in one house. Why does the Delta matter, and what can be done to save it? There's renewed talk about a peripheral canal.
In case you haven't heard, one of the world's most popular landmarks is turning 75. We'll go behind the scenes of an unprecedented public art exhibition, guaranteed to make you look at the Golden Gate Bridge in a whole new light.
Coming up next. Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Lauren Sommer from KQED's Quest series, and Marissa Lagos, San Francisco Chronicle staff writer, and Josh Richmond, Bay Area News Group's political reporter. Josh, is it my imagination, but this seems to be one of the most brutal budgets that Governor Brown has put before the legislature and before us in many decades.
Yeah, there's very little good news to be found here, and this is after years of having made some substantial cuts as it is. But what he rolled out on Monday, as he announced that our budget deficit has swelled from around $9 billion to about $16 billion. Are things like reducing state workers' pay by 5%, shortening the work week, cutting in-home supportive services, which is services to keep the elderly and blind and disabled in their homes longer instead of having them institutionalized, cuts to CalWorks, the Welfare to Work program, cuts to Medi-Cal, cuts to child care services. There's really nobody who's not going to feel some pain here. Public schools, K-12 schools, and higher education are mostly unscathed, given voters choose in November to pass the governor's tax plan, which involves a 4-year quarter-cent sales tax increase and a 7-year increase in income taxes for those who make $250,000 a year or more. Without that, you'll see shorter school years by weeks, not days. You'll see another $500 million hit each to the CSU and UC systems. Really, really horrendous cuts that are going to have very substantial impacts for a lot of people all up and down the state.
Josh, are you saying that even if Governor Brown's measure qualifies for the ballot, gets on the ballot, we vote for it, all of those services that you talked about in the front would still be impacted?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that Governor Brown's tax increase is earmarked 89% to K-12 education, 11% to community colleges. It'll relieve some of the pressure on other areas of the budget, but those cuts are going to happen, as far as he's concerned, one way or the other. Now, Darrell Steinberg, the state Senate President pro tem, held a press conference just a few hours after the governor's on Monday, said that they're going to try to negotiate and find ways to buy down the most egregious cuts in one way or another if they possibly can. But when you're dealing with a smaller pie, the slices get smaller no matter how you cut them, is the takeaway.
And that's a big part of the problem here, right? We have seen year after year of cuts in a lot of these programs. In-home supportive services, those folks have already had to go to court to prevent even deeper cuts. You see, these are minimum wage workers for the most part, who are really the only lifeline between somebody being put into a home or staying at home, and which by the way, we'd probably end up paying for as taxpayers. You know, I think it's important too that the governor, as much as he has slammed his predecessor for sort of creative accounting and gimmicks, has certainly moved around some money. He's proposing to use hundreds of millions of dollars from that homeowner settlement that the Attorney General helped negotiate, the 50-state settlement. And that's something that I think you're going to see a lot of pushback on. This is supposed to help homeowners who are still at risk of losing their houses. We're seeing, you know, more proposed cuts to the courts. The Chief Justice is out there really screaming that we cannot take this. We're going to not really have justice in the state. And I don't think she's being hyperbolic, because if you can't get, you know, a lawsuit heard, if you have to wait months and months for a criminal trial, what are we going to see? We're going to probably see more plea bargains, and we're going to see jails even more crowded.
In fact, the Chief Justice named a committee today that's going to spend the next few weeks doing nothing but working the legislature over trying to impress this upon them. And I think it's important that the public also realize that you know, philosophical and rhetorical opposition to taxes aside, even if these taxes pass in November, this budget is still $15 billion smaller than what the state budget was 6 years ago. I mean, there have been deep cuts in a lot of these programs.
And something like $40 billion less than what it was projected to be, right?
Well, I guess the people who might be pleased somewhat by this are the Republicans in the legislature, who have fought for cuts in government. They've got cuts in government. Have they come up with any suggestion as to what we do with the people who don't have these services that eventually end up on the tax roll?
Not that we've seen so far. In speaking with reporters after the governor's press conference, the Senate Republican leader, Bob Huff, basically said he was engaged in some rhetoric at the time, but he said
in the Capitol?
I know, it's hard to believe, it's incredible. But he said that you know, to make a real cut in California spending, he would cut the Democratic majority in the legislature, because it's policies that drive budgets. You know, as far as they're concerned, there's still too much spending. And he talked about you know, the fact that because budgets, although not tax increases, can now be passed by majority rule under Prop 25 of 2010. He expects that they'll be twiddling their thumbs. The Republicans will be twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the Democrats to engage them as this budget process goes on. Both the governor and Senator Steinberg are adamant that they will have a budget, and Speaker Perez as well, are adamant they'll have a budget by June 15th.
So what is the legislative office saying? That this is these are good numbers, or they could? No,
in fact, the legislative analyst's office says it's worse than that. They say that the governor's revenue estimates may have been about $500 million too rosy, although they're still reasonable. They also said, though, that he may have overestimated the money that the state will reap from the dissolution of redevelopment agencies to the tune of about $900 million. So that, yeah, $100 million there starts to add up.
When you're talking billions, I don't know.
Right?
You know.
Well, let's go to the guys that are being blamed from one side to the other.
For
That's the
everything in
legislature.
California.
And so they're faced with a test, too, in the legislature. Tell us, what is Proposition 28 about, and what would it do?
Well, backing up a little bit, 22 years ago, California voters passed a proposition which limited the number of years a lawmaker could spend in Sacramento to 6 years or 3 terms in the Assembly, and 8 years or 2 terms in the Senate. Now we have a proposal, and for 14 years total, in case anybody didn't want to do quick math. Now we have a proposal to lower the amount of time they can spend there to 12 years, but allow it to all happen in one house. So you could spend 12 years in the Assembly or 12 years in the Senate. This was put on the ballot by the LA Chamber of Commerce along with the labor coalition down there. And the argument by good government groups and other supporters is essentially that what the idea behind term limits were to sort of make a legislature that was more diverse, which it has achieved to a large part, but also that was less sort of beholden to special interests. And what a lot of these groups say is that that hasn't happened. In fact, because they're so inexperienced, they're more beholden to special interests. Lobbyists have more power. Staff has more power. And so the idea is that if you let somebody sort of stay in one place the whole time, they wouldn't constantly be running for office, and they maybe could get some of that institutional memory back. You know, opponents say this is a trick that essentially most people don't spend 14 years in Sacramento. They go on, run for other offices, return to what they were doing, and so that they think this would actually increase the amount of time that lawmakers spend there. They say that, you know, essentially when you're an incumbent, it's way easier to win than if you're running for a new seat. So on one side, we have these kind of good government groups and Democrats. The other side, we have several out-of-state groups that work on term limit issues and the Republican Party. And so it's really kind of shaping up to be a very partisan fight.
Yeah, because the math is kind of confusing on this. I mean, what are voters going to see on the ballot? What is it actually going to say?
Well, that's something that I think the opponents have problems with, is that it does say it reduces the amount of time. And it does, by years. You know, and most of this is speculation in terms of how long, what will people do. This is really similar to what we voted on a few years back that was pretty handily defeated because it would have impacted current lawmakers. It was pushed by the Speaker. We all know how dismal the public thinks of the legislature, their approval ratings. So this time they took that out. They said only moving forward are we going to do this.
So who's behind this?
So as I mentioned, these two groups in LA put it on the ballot. So there is both business and labor support. I think that a lot of the folks you see pushing it are these sort of good government type groups, which do tend to be more on the left side of things. But I think that's what's interesting, is that it's not, the Democratic Party certainly has supported this, but I don't think this is their baby, so to speak. Opponents might disagree with that. And there isn't really a ton of organized opposition.
Well, who are the people? I mean, do we know, is it business interests? Is it lobbyists? I mean, that's business interests.
Well, as I mentioned, the LA Chamber was a big supporter early on, and the money we've seen flow in has been largely from these sort of good government type groups, but also from folks who have business in front of the legislature and want to endear themselves to the Democratic majority. So it's all politics, even if it's sponsored by people outside of the political sort of spectrum.
So it's not the Republicans or the Democrats, or the Democrats or the Republicans just trying to change the numbers, or?
I mean, not as such. As I said, the Democrats are for this, the Republicans are against it, so it kind of has boiled down into a more partisan issue. But I don't think that it's fair to say the Democratic Party went out and put this on the ballot. And yeah, we'll see. I think that it's one of those ones where voters are really going to have to look at their voter guide and kind of do some research to decide, because it is a bit confusing.
I had heard a tried and true Republican like Dan Schnurr calling for continuity. You know, there must be some call out there.
Right.
Do you know if there's any polling on it? How's the public feel about it?
There's only been one poll. It was before money was starting to be spent, and it was polling on the yes side. So I think it depends on how much sort of both sides can get out.
Okay, so we return to another unsolved issue as to how long you should be allowed to stay in Sacramento, to another unsolved issue. And Lauren, that would be, what is different about this plan to save the Delta than those plans we've heard about for the last couple of decades?
Right, and I think for a lot of Californians, they've heard of the Delta. They're probably not really sure why it's an important place. Basically, for about 25 million Californians, when you turn on your tap, you're probably getting some water from the Delta. I mean, it's really the heart of the state's water system. It supplies water to Silicon Valley, to Central Valley farms, and to Southern California cities. But what's happened as we've relied more and more on the Delta is that its ecosystem has crashed. You have a number of endangered species, including Chinook salmon. They've really plummeted in the recent years. So limits have been put in place to limit the amount of water that can be pumped from the Delta in order to help these species recover. You can probably guess the people that are used to getting that water are pretty unhappy about that. The situation, it's gone to the courts. And what's happening this year is the state is putting together some pretty ambitious plans to hopefully solve this issue once and for all. And for people that have voted in the state a while, they've heard about this. The plan is called the Peripheral Canal. In 1982, it was actually defeated by California voters. It's basically a giant tunnel or canal that would take water upstream of the Delta, pump it around the Delta, which prevents the water coming from the Delta ecosystem itself. Supporters say the water supply would be more reliable. There's environmental groups, fishing groups that say you're going to see some pretty bad impacts on endangered species. And then there's the price tag, $12 to $14 billion, possibly more.
before the bonds are paid off, right? I mean, that's just the cost of the canal.
Yes, it's an ambitious project to say the least in terms of cost, and part of it actually hinges on the water bond that is currently on the state ballot for November. Some of that money would actually go to the parts of this plan, but there's been a lot of discussion about pulling the water bond from the ballot, obviously with some of the other things going on in November.
And the governor is probably one of those who would not like to see people have to choose on these issues. But what exactly would the North gain and the South lose, or vice versa?
Yeah, and in the 80s, that's exactly how the debate was cast.
Yes.
Northern California versus Southern California. I think now there's a real recognition with issues like climate change, the state's water supply is going to become less and less reliable. So you're definitely seeing parties on both sides really start to come together on some of this stuff. You know, before it was environmentalists kind of versus the farmers. People are trying to find solution in this case, but a long way to go on that.
So the governor, I know, has talked a lot about the fact that he doesn't think we need this bond measure right now, that a lot can be done without it, that there's been this talk of this massive plan that the Department of Water Resources, I believe, has been working on for many years. Do we have any sense when that might come out, or what it might say, or and kind of, is this all about the peripheral canal, or are there other issues that they're dealing with?
Yeah, so they just announced that they're going to delay the release of the plan. We are expecting an announcement in July from the governor about what he's really going to be supporting. Now, the other key component besides this big tunnel is a lot of habitat restoration. That's kind of how they're planning on mitigating some of these impacts on the endangered species. That's very expensive and very controversial as well.
Very controversial with some of the farmers who have been long established in the area, right? I mean, that amounts to eliminating a lot of agricultural land, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to try and count the number of interest groups in this debate, you wouldn't be able to. It's incredible.
So, a while back, Senator Dianne Feinstein thought she had a clue as to how we could avoid some of the water fights. Whatever that agreement was that everybody fought over, so does it matter in this new look at the Delta?
I think people are trying to wipe the slate clean a little bit, to saying that maybe we can come to a plan that can avoid some of the battles and litigation. That's a big question mark at this point.
So when I first started covering Sacramento, my first day was a 18-hour day on the water bond when they finally got that. And it was a very bipartisan deal, and everybody came out and saying, "Kumbaya, aren't we great? We actually did something." I mean, why would they be dialing it back then? If we need this, if it's going to cost that much, what's the thinking behind? Is it just a political calculation, do you think, or is it the fact that there's money from ratepayers that they can use in the meantime?
Yes, there will be some money definitely from the water districts that would use this water for this big construction project. But where the money comes from is a huge, huge question mark, one that the governor is going to have to address.
Well, my thanks, Laura. To you, at least it's a problem that seems far away in the future compared to the problems that Josh talked to us about. Okay.
I guess unless the big one strikes.
Right. Well, you can hear the final installment of Quest's three-part series on the Delta Monday morning at 6:30 or 8:30 on KQED Public Radio. And there's a link to the entire series from our webpage, kqed.org/thisweek. Next weekend, the city of San Francisco will celebrate a milestone, the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. To honor the occasion, a group of artists are staging a unique art exhibition titled International Orange. Scott Schaefer has a preview.
The Golden Gate Bridge is such an iconic part of the Bay Area landscape, it's hard to imagine a time when the short, scenic drive from Marin to San Francisco was a first.
May 28th, 1937. Opening day.
When it opened, thousands came to marvel at the tallest and longest single-span suspension bridge in the world. Opening celebrations lasted an entire week with pageants, parades, and speeches. Also on hand, a human ribbon of beauty queens.
The Fiesta Queens were the final ribbon, as it were, in the various ribbons that were cut to open the bridge. They were holding hands across the roadway, and they part, and the cars could drive through.
Anandamai Arnold is one of 15 artists commissioned for International Orange, a new public art exhibition honoring the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. She's creating a series of dresses based on the Fiesta Queens from the bridge's opening. To inspire the design for each dress, she's compiled historical research about the counties which funded the bridge, carefully choosing symbols that reflect the spirit of each region.
I tried to interview sort of people from different counties and talk to them and say, what is meaningful to you about the place, not just what would you see as a tourist. Marin is got the tunnel that you drive through with the rainbow painted on it. You go through that and you're in Marin and you feel like, ah! So that's going to get worked into my design for Marin.
So I know one of the last dresses you're working on is for San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Can you show me what you've got?
Yeah. I'm hoping to do some kind of phoenix in the front, which has become somewhat of a symbol of the city since the earthquake. This was going to be just on the skirt, and then I said, oh, it's not nearly unfurled enough for a phoenix, so now it's moved up and it's going to go all the way to the top. And then I've been testing out different colors of orange.
Unlike the original dresses, Anandamai's creations will be crafted almost entirely from paper.
The dresses are all made of paper with some fabric to reinforce them, but I sew it, I glue it, I cut it, I stretch it. And the crepe paper, the reason it's so special to work with is because it's all gathered up. And so it has spring in it, so if you stretch just one part, then it's no longer flat. It gets all these different undulating shapes. I just stretched the paper to get it to be the right shape. You'd never do that with cloth. You'd have to cut it and piece it all together.
Wow. That looks awesome. It really comes alive when you put it on. You know.
Yeah, I like them worn. So
what does it feel like to have it on?
Fairly comfortable. This one does have its secret plant inside.
Can we see it?
I don't know if it's possible to see when it's on.
I don't know. Yeah.
No, maybe it is. The hem needs a little finishing. You can't see the whole thing from here.
A pot plant.
Yes.
The underground economy.
Yes.
So you can't really think about Mendocino without thinking about that.
Anandamai Arnold, in some ways, really gets to the heart of this whole conversation about innovation and creativity and looking things in a different way. The work is conceptually sound, but it's also so beautifully made.
Because crepe paper and fog aren't a good mix, Anandamai's dresses will be some of the last artworks installed at Fort Point, the Civil War-era military base that will house the International Orange Exhibition. Installation of the less delicate works has already begun.
When thinking about an art project for the Golden Gate Bridge's 75th anniversary, I was really fascinated with this idea of a fictional souvenir shop. And since so many tourists visit the bridge every year, this idea of a store in which everything was just saturated with the color of the bridge, but in the end nothing is for sale. It's more about the kind of memory of the bridge and the color, which is what most people actually take away with them when visiting.
These buntings are by Allison Smith, and they're graduated colors of orange, as you can see, and some of them are international orange, specifically in reference to the color of the bridge and the title of this exhibition.
As director for the Foresight Foundation, curator Cheryl Haynes has overseen several installations at other sites in the Presidio, but the Fort Point location is presenting a unique set of challenges.
It is a huge challenge to install electronics in an old fort, which is basically outside. And yesterday, the fog was just pouring over the side of the fort, so it's really damp in here, really salty, and that is not a good mix with electronics. The piece I'm doing for the project here is called Span. I think one of the things that draws people to the Golden Gate and why it's so beautiful and amazing is the contrast between the mountains and the coastline, which are so variegated and changeable, and this human structure, the sort of straight line of the bridge against that. So there's such a contrast between those two different forms that's just stunning.
As a East Bay person, I never drive across it. I mean, I could probably count on two hands the times I've been over it, but doing this project's been amazing because now I feel a huge connection to it.
And that's exactly what organizers are hoping for: fresh perspectives and appreciation for a familiar and beloved landmark.
Well, the International Orange Exhibition opens on Memorial Day weekend, and it will remain on view to the public through October. You can find a link to all of KQED's coverage of the Golden Gate Bridge anniversary celebration at kqed.org/thisweek. Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us here this evening. In closing, we remember Mexican author Carlos Fuente, who passed away Tuesday at the age of 83. His popular novel, The Old Gringo, was about San Francisco's journalist Ambrose Bierce, who disappeared during the Mexican Revolution. The 1989 film starred Jane Fonda and Gregory Peck. And here's a clip of Fuentes from the documentary Crossing Borders from KQED's archives.
I arrived in Mexico City when I was 15 years old, after having been raised abroad in South America and the United States, with an idea of Mexico and of Mexico City, and I wanted to confront that imagination of the city and of the country with the reality. And out of the disparities, out of the deep chasms between my imagination and the reality, my novels were born.
And a final program note, we're off next Friday for the Memorial Day holiday. Tune in the following week, June 1st, for our election special leading up to the June 5th primary. We'll see you then. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for arts programming on This Week in Northern California is provided by Diane B. Wilsey. Additional funding comes from the George Frederick Jewett Foundation, Helen Sarah Steyer, and Gretchen Kimball.